Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David, welcome back.
Thanks, Sky. So happy to be back.
Happy holidays. This is going to be coming out at the end of December, so hopefully everyone had a good Christmas. Do you guys have plans? Are you going away? Are you going with family? What are you doing?
Got family coming here to see us, and it's just going to be a quiet Christmas holiday. What's going to be more exciting, though, is right after the new year, we're packing up and driving from Nashville to UC Santa Cruz, where my son is transferring to, and so he needs a car there. So how do you get a car from Nashville to California? You drive it. So it's
Have you done that before?
My longest drive of my life is Nashville to the western edge of the Colorado Rockies, sort of western Colorado, which is a formidable drive. Formidable, but it is not the 2,400 mile drive that awaits us.
Well, 2 summers ago, my son and I bought a car out in California, in Los Angeles, a 2013 Mazda Miata. I used to have a Miata years ago, and I found a used one in Southern California that was in great shape with no rust. So I left it at a friend's house, and then my son and I flew out to California and drove that tiny little 2-seat roadster all the way across the country.
Amazing.
It was great. We went to the Grand Canyon, Las Vegas. We did a whole bunch of stuff. And but man, that is a tiny car. And it's so loud, even with the top up, that the whole time we drove, we had our earbuds in, listening to podcasts or whatever, because you just couldn't hear each other even talk in that little tiny car. But that was an adventure. And yeah. So
yeah, you
good luck.
Yeah, I know. I just from driving from Nashville to, Colorado, you get a sense of how huge this country is. And it'll be that in spades. So that's our big event coming up and it'll happen right after this podcast is published.
Well, I hope you have a great time and the weather holds out for you. Okay, let's get into what I want to talk about today, which is mostly various aspects of free speech and the First Amendment. And let's begin with Twitter. There's a lot of attention going on right now with Elon Musk, who seems to be in some kind of strange implosion professionally and personally. A couple weeks ago, he came out with what he's calling the Twitter files.
Mm-hmm.
So as the new owner of the company, he has access to the archives of information. It turns out that back in October of 2020, during the campaign, various news outlets were reporting about Hunter Biden's laptop and content coming from that laptop. And in October of 2020, the Biden campaign reached out to Twitter to ask them to please not publish some content on their website that they didn't want publicized. And Twitter agreed and did not publish that content. Well, now that that's public, Elon Musk and others are coming out saying this is evidence of collusion between government entities and the previous owners of Twitter and management of Twitter to suppress information and speech. And even Tucker Carlson, everyone's favorite Fox News commentator, came out and he said, this is a quote, that this shows a systemic violation of the First Amendment, the largest example of that in modern history. What's going on here? And is the Twitter file thing and what happened with the Biden campaign really the suppression of free speech?
Right. Okay. So it is not, and just underline this, it is not a violation of the First Amendment, despite what Tucker Carlson says and despite what Elon Musk says. And that's very important. That's not a small point, right? So a lot of people, when I fact checked that and said, this is not a violation of the First Amendment, Elon Musk actually responded and accused me of discrediting myself, Sky. But this is not even a close call. It is not a violation of the First Amendment. And this is important. This is not a side point. This is not a small point. It's an important point. Why is this not a violation of the First Amendment? The First Amendment is only violated when government actors suppress speech. Now, there's a very small category of First Amendment violations when private actors suppress speech, but that's only when these private actors are either acting under the compulsion of the government, but then really the government suppression, government compulsion is the First Amendment violation. It's the government action there, or if they're fulfilling a government function, such as running a private prison, for example, or a company town, most famously. None of that's at issue here.
And this is a broader issue of the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are limitations on governmental power over the citizenship.
On government.
Government can't tell me I can't worship a certain way, can't tell me I have to say something or not say something. It can't put troops in my home against my will. All that kind of stuff is in those first 10 amendments. So it doesn't limit private actors, it limits the government's action.
Right. So it limits the government. The Biden campaign in 2020 was not the government. The Biden campaign is a private entity. Joe Biden in 2020 is not the government. Joe Biden was a private citizen. The Democratic National Committee, even though there might be members of elected officials on the DNC, but the DNC is a private entity. It is not the government. Twitter is a private entity, not the government. So all of these private entities talking back and forth to each other about what to put on Twitter is not a First Amendment violation. Now, interestingly, there were some requests from the Trump White House for removal of tweets from Twitter. And that is, in all likelihood, also not a First Amendment violation, in spite of the fact that the Trump White House is an arm of the government. Because the mere fact that the government asks a private entity to do something is not the same thing as compulsion. A request from a government or even communication between a private entity and the government does not then render whatever action the private entity takes government action. And there's a ton of confusion about that on Twitter. There are actual legal tests that are in play that have to demonstrate something other than a request. They have to demonstrate something other than communication. They have to demonstrate actual compulsion. And
some kind of threat for non-compliance.
Right, exactly. So you've got to show some actual government compulsion. Otherwise, look, the government communicates into the private sector all the time. You have government, you have members of Congress who condemn Twitter, or you have members of the executive branch who will condemn this private company or condemn that private company, or that will provide information to private companies in pursuant to, for example, intelligence information that a private company might need to determine whether something, if it has like an anti-misinformation policy, to determine whether something is misinformation. There are all kinds of ways the government communicates with private entities without turning whatever the private entity does into public action. And there's just an enormous amount of just incredible legal misinformation flowing around Twitter about what is or is not government compulsion.
So to illustrate this, if a private company like Twitter or Facebook or the Wall Street Journal, pick your private communications company, says, we no longer are going to publish any dad jokes. We're just opposed to dad jokes in all forms, right, and we will block that content and remove it from our sites. That is not a violation of the First Amendment. No. Because they are a private entity choosing for themselves what they wish to say or not say on their platform. And you can be upset about that. You can say, well, I'm taking my business elsewhere. But it's not a governmental restriction on your speech.
And it's also not a governmental restriction if a presidential campaign says, your dad joke, here's a dad joke you haven't that you haven't taken down pursuant to your anti-dad joke policy. And similarly, if you have, say, a Trump White House or a Biden White House and says, here's a dad joke you didn't take down pursuant to your anti-dad joke policy, that doesn't make it automatically a government action. There's actually, Skye, a Second Circuit case that is on this issue involving the NRA. And in that circumstance, government officials from the state of New York, including licensing officials, people who regulated financial institutions, put out warnings about financial institutions and condemnations of financial institutions that did business with the NRA. And some of those financial institutions dropped their business. And so this is a case winding up through the courts to determine whether or not that is actual coercion when these financial institutions drop their business with the NRA. And in that circumstance, I think there might be government coercion. There might be government coercion. And if you actually look at that case, you will see it is a far greater level of implied government threat than what we have seen in play in the social media world. Now, so far, the courts have held that that's not coercion. It's not coercion, even though the level of implied government threat is greater than what we've seen in anything that's been uncovered in the various Twitter files so far. So you have to draw a line between state action and censorship, and that state action that the state has to it has to do the censoring. And if there is a situation where the state says, please, and the private entity says no, private entity can say no. If a state says please and a private entity says yes, that doesn't necessarily make it state action. It's a much more difficult to establish that when private entities are the ones making the call.
Right. But if the state were to say, please, and if you don't, we are going to fine you or take away a license or put you in jail.
Correct.
That's clear coercion.
Yeah.
Okay, going back to the Twitter files thing, I think one of the reasons why this seems to have gotten so much traction, particularly with conservative audiences, is there's this larger narrative that's being woven right now that says social media platforms have a liberal bias and they are suppressing content and ideas that are coming from the right end of the political spectrum. And I haven't looked at the details of what it was that the Biden administration, or sorry, the Biden campaign was asking Twitter to remove. But my understanding is that this content from Hunter Biden was not political. It was not scandalous in the sense of damaging to the Biden campaign. It was essentially junk pics, inappropriate nude images of Hunter Biden. I understand, which I can sort of understand why somebody wouldn't want that public.
Right.
But it isn't exactly the suppression of material that would have brought down the Biden campaign.
No.
So to this larger point that people think that social media platforms are biased against conservatives, there's been a movement like in Texas where they passed this State Bill 20 that prohibits large platforms from censoring viewpoints. Can you explain what's going on in Texas and why this may have national implications for speech and social media?
Both Texas and Florida have passed laws regulating the way in which social media can moderate content. And they're a little bit different. So Texas is a bit more expansive. It's saying that social media companies must adopt a particular kind of moderation policy that applies to all speech on the platform. Florida's a little bit more narrow. It's mainly designed to protect politicians, and it's not exclusively designed to do that, but one of its core features is it protects political speakers on social media platforms. This is something enacted after Donald Trump was kicked off Twitter, for example. And it's very important to emphasize this is a big change in the GOP stance towards corporate speech. Okay, so for a very long time, if you're going to talk about what is the Republican position on corporate speech, the Republican position would be that corporations as private entities have the ability to engage in political speech. They have the ability to exercise religious freedoms, even if they're small, like Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop, or huge, like the multi-billion-dollar national corporation Hobby Lobby. So small or big, companies have a right to engage in political speech and to conduct their policies accordingly. And it include not just political speech, but also have religious free exercise rights. Well, what these laws are saying is, no. We want to now start restricting the speech of these private corporations, and make no mistake that a moderation policy is a form of corporate speech, because what they're doing is they're saying, this is the kind of platform that we want to have. And it's a kind of culture. It's a kind of content that we want to present to the public as this is what this platform is. And so what's happened is that a lot of folks on the right are shifting their views of free speech, and they're kind of trying to backfill an explanation for it. So they're trying to say, well, wait a minute, Twitter's the traditional public square. It's not. Or that providing a forum for speech is a traditional public forum, traditional public function. So Twitter is like the government. It's not. And so they're really altering fundamentally the traditional Republican approach to free speech and corporate free speech to try to regulate so big social media.
Okay, so here's what I don't understand. On the one hand, you have Twitter is requested to remove nude images of a presidential candidate's son.
Right.
And Twitter voluntarily says, okay, we'll remove that. And politicians on the right and political activists on the right are screaming, you're violating freedom of speech by removing nude images of Hunter Biden. But then these same people are saying to Twitter, Facebook, other social media platforms, the government is forcing you and requires you to publish political speech that we like.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not a violation of the First Amendment?
Well, here's their argument. What they would say is that these social media companies have become so powerful that we can't have free speech in this country unless there is free speech on social media platforms. And so therefore, the government needs to step in to mandate free speech on social media platforms.
But isn't there free speech on social media platforms because no one is stopping you from creating another social media platform?
Well, it's interesting because then the argument becomes, well, wait a minute. Sure, we can make another social media platform, but not enough people will be on it for it to be meaningful. And when you really start to drill down into the argument, it essentially what the argument becomes is something like this. I have a right to post my thoughts publicly on a social media platform that I did not create and that I do not pay for, so long as that social media platform is big enough. And so that the very size of the social media platform gives me a right to publish, right? And
as if it's a public utility.
As if it's a public utility. And they will often use that phrase, like as if it's a public utility. But again, when you look at these social media platforms, one of the things you're going to notice is there's a bunch of them. There's a lot of them. There's no such thing as a monopoly, right?
Right.
So there's a bunch of them. So there's a bunch of places you can go post. If you don't like what happened on Twitter, you can go to Reddit. If you don't like Reddit's moderation policy, you can go to Facebook or Instagram. If you don't want to be moderated at all, basically, you can go to Gab or Truth Social, where Trump is. Or if you really want to enter the Wild West, you can go to Telegram. I mean, there's all kinds of places.
Right.
But what ends up happening is some people have really focused in on one place. So for example, I have a lot more followers on Twitter than I have on Instagram, or I have on Post, which is a new social media platform I just created a profile on. I've deleted my Facebook page, so I have most of my followers are on Twitter. And so what ends up happening is if you're knocked off of Twitter, for a lot of people, that's their platform, and they'd have to start over somewhere else. But that doesn't mean that it's the government. The fact that it would be really inconvenient for you to be kicked off this one platform doesn't.
You don't have a constitutionally protected right to a large Twitter following.
Right. No, of course not. Of course not.
So let's change the details a little bit and do a hypothetical. Under this kind of legislation, couldn't you say to a Fox News, the largest cable news station in the country that has the largest audience, that we need to reinstate essentially the fairness doctrine? Like, you need to have more liberal voices on Fox News because you have such a huge following. It's unfair that you suppress liberal progressive ideas. Isn't that the same argument?
Well, yeah. So essentially what you're saying is what as someone on the right would say, no, here's what we want to say. What we want to say is we want to use the government to mandate more free speech by large, influential private entities, okay? But only these certain ones, these social media entities. But once you breach that firewall, so what you have to do for that law to be constitutional, for the law to be constitutional, that you're going to be able to regulate Facebook and Twitter's moderation policies, you're going to be breaching a constitutional firewall. You're asking the courts to say that traditional free speech doctrine has to be changed, all right? And once you change traditional free speech doctrine to grant the government more authority over corporate expression, it's not the case that you can just change it and say, but only in ways that we like. No, you're granting the government more authority, period. And so it's not a situation where you can say, well, we're granting the government more authority, but only to do the things that we really want it to do. That is not the way First Amendment doctrine works. And so a lot of these folks are quite short-sighted, because of what they're doing is they're begging the courts to grant the government a ton more authority over private speech. And then once the government has that authority, now I don't think they'll win. I don't think the government will get that authority. But if they do win, then what you're going to be looking at is federal and state elections, where a lot of the battle is now going to be over social media moderation, rather than that being something that's a controversy settled with the social media companies themselves.
Okay, not that I always take your opinion as gospel truth, but I do value your legal insights because they're far more informed than my own. And to me, this feels like a no-brainer. Like, this is just, as you said, you don't think it's going to win, but it seems so obvious that it's a violation of freedom of speech and an overextension of government authority in an area it shouldn't be. And yet, the Fifth U.S. Circuit of Appeals upheld this Texas law.
Right.
And so I'm assuming the people on the Fifth Circuit know a thing or two about the Constitution.
Oh, for sure.
So what is the argument that has gotten the law even? I can understand when a state legislature passes some ridiculous law to appease their base that doesn't stand a chance. Like in Florida, the Stop Woke Act that DeSantis pushed through has been picked apart by the courts as unconstitutional on numerous fronts. But I understand why he did it for political reasons.
Right.
And I understand why Texas legislature passed this law, because it's red meat for the base. Why did the Fifth Circuit uphold it? And I believe it's going to the Supreme Court now, correct?
Yeah.
How did it even get that far?
I don't know if an appeal has actually been filed yet to the Supreme Court. The Texas law has actually already been to the Supreme Court. So the Fifth Circuit allowed the law to be enforced. The Supreme Court blocked enforcement of the law and sent it back to the Fifth Circuit for reconsideration. And the Fifth Circuit said, "No, we've reconsidered it, and we think the law's still constitutional."
Yeah,
unusual.
I want to understand their argument.
Yeah, really unusual that they did that. And I don't have the opinion in front of me right now, but what so it is I'm not going to be able to quote to you all of the elements of it. But essentially, what you're talking about when you're talking about the efforts to censor or to limit social media moderation or regulate social media moderation is an idea that platforms work as something kind of like a common carrier. Okay, so what is a common carrier? And a common carrier is traditionally been something like, say, the phone company or UPS or FedEx and AT&T, for example, is a common carrier. And these are entities that have traditionally used in public assets, roads, broadcast, rights of way to create communications infrastructure.
Right, more utility again.
More utility type. And what they've done is because they're a common carrier, because they hold themselves out as serving the public in a function that in many ways often overlaps with government functions. So UPS and FedEx are direct competitors with the post office, for example. That they hold themselves out as facilitating public communication point to point. So when I call you or I call you and call somebody else in, I'm not calling you unless I'm then calling into, or say, a CNN where they're going to broadcast my words on AT&T. This is generally point-to-point kinds of communication using a combination of public and private assets that have created nationwide infrastructure. That's when you have traditionally had common carriers. And if you're going to compare common carrier, use the traditional way that we talk about common carriers, the better analogy would be to say a Twitter direct message or a Facebook Messenger message, right? There's never been any sort of situation where there's never been a conception of a common carrier as something being a common carrier of like little miniature op-eds, which are what tweets are or Facebook posts. The analogy is much more to, say, letters to the editor, right? Where you write in, you've written in to, say, your local newspaper and you want them to publish your letter to the editor, or probably even more precise, that posting comments on big time news sites or smaller news sites like the Dispatch. We have comments, but that's not what a common carrier is. It's not. It's sort of like calling a table a duck. A common carrier has never been really held to mean I have that any given entity is going to be required to publicly publish my opinions, right?
Right. That's where it breaks down for me as well. Like, I can see the argument that everyone should have equal access to a public utility. I don't think that if you disagree with me politically, you should not have access to the telephone lines.
Right.
But there's a difference between everyone having equal access to a public utility and everyone having equal access to a public platform.
Right.
And that's where it breaks down for me.
Yep. And a lot of time people say, well, Twitter is like the public square. It's not. It's not. So,
but even if it were, we wouldn't say anyone and everyone's ideas should have a place in the public square. We limit what we allow to be displayed in public.
Well, we have time, place, and manner restrictions. If it's a true public square, like a public park, there's going to be very limited ability to engage in viewpoint discrimination. In other words, you're going to be able to go into a public park and say most anything you want to say. Now, you're not going to be able to engage in indecency. You're not going to be able to be nude in the public square. You're not going to.
But Twitter is not a public park. If I have a large parcel of land that I privately own and I open it for use for other people and I make it a beautiful space that people like to linger in, but it's still owned by me, I have every right to step in and say, sorry, I'm not going to allow that fire and brimstone street preacher to disrupt the public, quote unquote, public space that I privately own and created. Correct.
And that's why the common carrier argument breaks down. It's just not what a common carrier has traditionally been. If you're going to look at what are traditional common carriers, they bear no relation. They bear no resemblance to a Facebook or a Twitter. There's never been this ability to have a right to a common carrier of my op-eds, for example.
Okay, let's turn a corner a little bit on this conversation of social media platforms. And let's imagine the world in which this Texas bill becomes the law of the land, and social media platforms can no longer discriminate or limit large kinds of speech that they currently may limit or prohibit. And neo-Nazis are allowed to publish whatever they want on Twitter, and fascists who, I don't know, like I said, hate dad jokes or whatever are allowed on Facebook. All these. That means that these platforms are going to be carrying content messages and just toxic sludge that some people are going to find not only unappealing, but it could very well be threatening or damaging and cause actual harm, which then opens these platforms up to lawsuits from the other side, which...
You're creating a giant mess, Sky. Right. So just a giant mess. So let's say you have the Supreme Court says, state governments can call these things common carriers. They can tightly regulate the moderation policies of these entities. or call them public accommodations, whatever you want, public accommodations, common carriers, and you break down that wall, that that First Amendment wall that provides private companies with the ability to sort of form a corporation and articulate and hold to certain corporate values. Think about what California is going to enact. And then Texas will have something, and Michigan will have something, and Kentucky will have something, and then Tennessee will have something. And it's just an absolute mess. And then, we are already seeing some of that mess happening in Europe, where governments have no sort of First Amendment limitation on their ability to regulate. And so, you would then think about what we're going to be doing, not just to free expression online, and to not just to free expression in general, really breaking down basic First Amendment protections. You're also then creating chaos and inflaming the culture war, because you're delegating to the government moderation policies of private entities on some of the most hot button topics of our time. And it's just not what the government is supposed to be doing.
And so your point is the Twitter I may experience here in Illinois could be very different than the Twitter someone else experiences in Texas because of what each state allows or doesn't allow Twitter to moderate. Is that
right? Yeah, right.
Okay, so,
exactly.
And then you get in arguments about that from state to state. But I want to talk about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, because my understanding is, because there are so many users on these platforms, Section 230 basically says Twitter cannot be held liable if I post something on its platform which is scandalous, salacious, libelous, whatever it might, illegal. If I say something that harms someone else or causes, there's been these tragic stories of young people attempting to take their own life or succeeding at it because of bullying online. The person who does the bullying can be held accountable, but the platform on which the bullying occurs is not liable or responsible for what happened. Is that a correct assessment of Section 230?
Yeah, basically look at it like this. So Section 230 does two things primarily. Thing number one is to say, if I am posting my content on a platform like Facebook, or a comment section of a newspaper, comments section on Washington Post or the Dispatch, you name it. If you had comments under the Holy Post YouTube page, right? That the fact that I post that comment on YouTube does not make it YouTube speech. That's point number one.
Mm-hmm.
And then point number two is YouTube has the ability to moderate my comments, not rewrite them, right? If it writes my comments, that's YouTube speech, but it has an ability to moderate my comments without converting my speech into YouTube speech. Okay. So, and this is the history of Section 230 is this. Do you remember back when there were three ways to get on this thing called the internet? AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy?
Yes, I do.
So two of those three services, CompuServe and Prodigy, were subject to lawsuits in New York. Over content that was posted onto message boards. Okay. One of the services moderated its message board and the other one didn't. And there were two court cases in New York courts. One said that if it's unmoderated content, it is not treated as the speech of the internet service provider.
It's the speech of the person who posted it.
Only the speech of the person who posted it. The other one said, well, they moderate, but so the fact that they moderate means it's joint speech.
So the service platform needs to take some responsibility for the speech because they could have removed it, and the fact that they didn't means in some way they're consenting to it.
Bingo. So then what that did early in the internet era is it placed platforms in this all or nothing dilemma. Okay, so if they didn't want to have any censorship, or if they didn't want to be liable, they'd have no moderation. Well, as we know, if there's no moderation, the internet, whatever site it is, turns into an open sewer immediately. Right. Well, then, but if they moderate at all, then they're liable. And so Congress steps in and says, no. And it created a free speech environment very much like the free speech environment that exists in the offline world. Like a lot of people say that Section 230 is this big giveaway to big tech. No, it kind of, in a rough way, approximates the way we view free speech in the offline world. And I'll give you a good example, Sky. Let's suppose you go to a town hall meeting, one of these contentious school board meetings, and they say, you have 2 minutes. You can't not direct profane personal attacks at, we don't want to see profane personal attacks directed at anybody. And we are asking you to keep your speech germane to the topic. So if the topic is new history curriculum and you want to talk about the high school football coach, sorry, you can't do that. Now, the fact that you've moderated that real world content does not then therefore mean that every person who speaks at the microphone is that every speech at the microphone is also the state's speech.
Right.
Of course not. Or similarly, if you're in a public university classroom, those are some of the most moderated places in America where a professor can say, no personal attacks on your fellow students, only speech germane to the content of the course. And that doesn't then therefore mean that every student who raises their hand, private citizen, to talk to the professor about the content of the course is engaging in state speech, right? So we know this all the time, that in the offline world, there is moderation that occurs without converting what we say into the state's speech. And so what Section 230 did was say, how can we do that in the online world? And the way that they came up with it was, well, look, if it's moderated comments, that's not going to be the speech of the platform. Now, what's really important to understand is that doesn't mean that everything that Twitter does is immune from liability. Twitter's own speech, when Twitter posts information, when Twitter curates the trending function, when Twitter's own speech, Twitter's responsible for its own actions, the speech that it engages in. And there's going to be an interesting case coming up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just accepted certiorari on it, where the allegation is that YouTube's algorithm was surfacing pro-ISIS material on YouTube. And so the question is YouTube's algorithm nothing more than sort of moderation like is protected by Section 230? Or is YouTube's algorithm, which surfaced this certain kind of content, is that algorithm sort of YouTube's own expression, if that makes sense? So it's going to be a very, very, very interesting case. And Sky, as you can tell, there's nothing super simple about all of this.
No, there isn't. And it's very, very messy. But there's been a lot in recent years, a lot of fingers pointed at social media as doing a great deal of social harm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you saw The Social Dilemma. Is that the name of the
I saw it.
Documentary on Netflix?
Mm-hmm.
And the way the algorithms work, and they silo us into these darker and darker corners of thought and isolate us from one another and create all kinds of social dysfunction. But going back to your analogy of the school board meeting, where there are some parameters put on what people can say and limitations on speech, but it doesn't mean that everything someone says is suddenly the speech of the school board meeting organizers. To push that metaphor to perhaps its extreme, if you know that every time Mrs. Johnson comes into the school board meeting, no matter what, she doesn't stick to the rules.
Right.
And she starts ranting on about, I don't know, something horribly anti-Semitic or something. And you have to interrupt her and you cut her mic and you have to kick her out every time. And she does that meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, but you still allow her to come and engage in that speech. At some point, do you have responsibility for even allowing her the microphone? Or is it only when she speaks? And the reason I'm saying this is because if the Texas bill goes through and suddenly these platforms are required to give a microphone, more or less, to speech that may incite violence, political violence, like we saw on January 6th, are they then responsible? Or is it, hey, we have no control. These people are saying crazy things, but we have to allow them?
There's going to be a lot of gray areas that are going to come up, because what the defenders of the Texas law would say is, no. what we're mandating is something much more like viewpoint neutrality and incitement. Incitement is not constitutionally protected speech, even under legal regimes that protect viewpoint neutrality. But as it takes 5 seconds of thinking through these issues to know that you're placing these social media platforms in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And in many ways, you might actually be regulating them in such a way as it kills their commercial viability. Right. So for example, one thing that we don't talk enough about when we're talking about social media and social media moderation, there is a reason why platforms like Gab are very small. It's because people don't want to be exposed to all that that you typically see on Gab, right? They don't want to go there. That's, they make the same choice you make to not see a bad movie, right? You don't want to see that stuff.
Or who wants to play in a game where there's no referees?
Right, exactly. And so a lot of people just don't want to be involved in that. And so the more that you make a social media company be like Gab, and the more you're going to sort of defeat the ability of that social media company to even be a viable commercial enterprise. Now, some people might say, great, I hate social media anyway. Well, you're not actually getting rid of it. You might be making it smaller and worse, perversely enough. So there are a lot of consequences of removing from these private entities the discretion to create a space that reflects the space they want to see, or that reflects their values.
Last thing on this point, and then we'll use the remainder of our time for one last issue. In recent history, the two things that come to my mind that social media platforms tried to either flag or remove was misinformation about the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then the Stop the Steal stuff that was going on after the 2020 election and into early 2021, where social media companies were flagging accusations as unverified, or this is false, or whatever it might be. It feels like in one report I read, 34 states have advanced legislation this year, I think all with Republican legislatures, to push bills requiring more speech to remain online, while Democratic legislatures, including California and New York, are advancing bills directing platforms to remove certain extremist content.
Right.
So, like those two recent examples, Stop the Steal, which did ultimately incite a violent riot in Washington, and then false information about the pandemic, which we can't necessarily quantify, but certainly led to deaths from people who, believed some of the nonsense that got through the filters. Shouldn't these platforms have some responsibility for allowing that content to flourish on their platforms, or can they hide behind Section 230 and say, "Oh, it's not our speech, and it's viewpoint neutrality,
right?
And you can't blame us."
Yeah, well, I think they should be able to hide behind Section 230, and I don't like the phrase "hide behind" because I think it implies that Section 230. I think something like Section 230 would be constitutionally mandated under current First Amendment law. Maybe not something exactly like Section 230, but something very similar to Section 230 would be essentially a constitutional mandate, because the question is then going to be, okay, wait, under what circumstances is your defamation my defamation? Under what circumstances is your misinformation my misinformation? And the more you allow the state to link together, so let me put it this way. Would we want a legal regime that says that when that student raises his hand in a classroom, that the professor is liable for whatever comes out of his mouth? The professor is liable.
No, but if the professor gives him an amplifier and a microphone to spread what comes out of his mouth, doesn't that professor then have some liability for advancing the messaging of the student?
Now, the professor could say, nobody is permitted to speak in my classroom, right? Now, but it's the fact that And then is the argument that anyone who raises their hand, well, the professor's then giving them access to the 35, 40, 45 students. And I don't think that's a sustainable way of thinking through a First Amendment. That, in other words, if I am a private citizen and I am in a forum that is moderated by another private citizen, that therefore, if I raise my hand and speak, that there's a joint liability with the person that is permitting me to raise my hand in an audience that is run by the person who's permitting me to raise my hand.
Well,
that is a really difficult,
I agree, but here's where the analogy breaks down and this gets back to perhaps that case that you were talking about with the algorithm. If that professor ran his classroom with an algorithm which was designed to amplify the most crazy ideas because they attract more engagement, then doesn't that professor now have some culpability? The professor's not just creating a neutral forum, but it's a forum that's designed to take the most extreme and sometimes irresponsible speech and magnify it.
Yeah, now that's when you might be getting into the algorithm issue.
Right.
So that's the YouTube. So the point there isn't, is YouTube liable for a video saying ISIS has some good ideas? The point is YouTube liable for amplifying and placing straight in your... So if the analogy there would be, if you have 100 people in your class and you have 3 pro-ISIS speakers, and here's your policy: pro-ISIS speakers get first dibs, everyone else is second. Well, then what I'm saying at that point is I am joining with or endorsing the pro-ISIS speech. You've got a much better argument, but the reason for it is because of the targeted enhancement of a particular point of view. Well, that's where it becomes maybe your speech as well, when you are targeting a particular kind of speech for enhancement and for broadcast, as opposed to simply saying, hey, here are the speech rules, and you can't say A, B, C, D, E, or F. And so long as you comply with those rules, you're allowed to speak on this platform. That's what Section 230 does. The question then on the algorithm is, to what extent is the algorithm the speech of the entity that created the algorithm? That's the real question there.
Well, yeah, I agree. But it seems to me, to give, say, a YouTube the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to assume that there's nobody at YouTube corporate that is saying, we want to advance the messaging of ISIS.
Right.
But they have created an algorithm which is designed to take the most outrageous and addictive kind of content and amplify it. And so by default, they're going to take messaging like ISIS or Proud Boys or Stop the Steal or anti-vaxxers and amplify it, even though they may not endorse any one of those particular messages. They've created a public utility. It'd be like if AT&T, which created our telephone networks, inherent to that network is whenever profanity is spoken, it connects you with 5 other households so they can hear it. They may not be themselves endorsing the profanity, but they're creating a system that magnifies it. And at some point, I don't know if it's speech necessarily, but it is the creation of a magnifying device that does harm to society. And that's where I feel we're in an uncharted territory here about how do you regulate these platforms. And I'm not sure where we are right now, where they don't have any responsibility or culpability is the right answer either.
Well, it's not where they don't have responsibility or culpability. And their algorithm, they would say, is not that we choose what's most inflammatory. Their algorithm that they would say is it's predictive of your preferences, right?
Then they're magnifying human nature.
They're magnifying your preferences is the way that they might say. So they're serving up to you what their algorithm says you would like to see. So that's one reason why, like, my Instagram Reels is full of videos of F-22s and F-18s, because I think or in SpaceX space launches, because they're predicting my preferences. And so that is a very interesting question that is subtly different from, and also quite substantially different from, a policy that says we are going to amplify outrageous content, right? And so if you say we're going to amplify outrageous content, that's a kind of editorial decision that is a content-based editorial decision that is different from saying we're amplifying and predicting your preferences. And that's why these algorithms...
But if you know that people's preferences is for outrageous content because of human nature, then you are facilitating that. It's a little bit like it's human nature to become addicted to tobacco.
Sure.
And so if we just simply are, we're just providing people more and more of the substance they're asking for, it's not our fault. That didn't work when the tobacco industry was taken down by lawsuits.
Well, but there's a big difference. The tobacco industry was taken down in many ways because the tobacco industry lied.
Fair enough.
Consumer fraud. And then the product itself was inherently empirically harmful to your health in a way that, and we can regulate toxins in a way that we cannot regulate speech. Because if you said, well, I'm going to regulate toxic speech, well, there goes your First Amendment.
Well, yeah, but back to the original point, YouTube is not bound by the First Amendment.
Right.
So they can say, we are not going to allow any ISIS material on our platform.
Sure.
Because we think this is harmful to our customers.
Sure. But then the question is, how much can the government mandate them to remove any kind of content? So yeah, that's why we have to stop thinking that every problem has a government solution.
I agree.
We got to stop with that. And so there are all kinds of decisions that YouTube makes, or that Twitter makes, or Facebook makes, that have negative effects. Like any private corporation, they have negative effects. And there's marketing that private corporations do that, is catering to our preferences. Sometimes it caters to us in ways that caters to some of our negative preferences. The question is, how much are we going to ask the government to step in here? And one of the key points is the differences between, one of the key points when it comes to something like a YouTube or a Twitter is when we're asking the government to step in, what we're ultimately asking the government to do is mandate that these companies restrict us in ways that the government wishes. And that's when you're beginning to really break down the First Amendment. Now, I'm totally fine with traditional legal regimes that hold each speaker liable for their own speech when it violates the law. And if the YouTube algorithm, if discovery indicates that there are ways in which social media's own efforts are represent a type of speech that is traditionally regulated under First Amendment principles, fine, have at it. But what I really object to is breaking down traditional First Amendment principles because there is speech that we don't like that we want the government to get at.
Okay, let's take the government out of the equation for a minute because there's a whole slew of lawsuits that are being processed right now. And I think Sarah Isger's husband is part of one of these in Texas, your co-host on Advisory Opinions, where coming out of the Stop the Steal movement in the 2020 election, Fox News, Rudy Giuliani, I forget who else, are being sued by different entities for false statements they made about, for example, Dominion voting machines. And some of these lawsuits have the potential to be incredibly damaging to these individuals and to Fox News. So there's a case where people were spewing lies that damaged the reputation of a corporation. Fox News gave them a platform to advance these lies, and Fox News is also being sued. So in that case, why isn't Fox News protected from responsibility by a Section 230?
So what Fox is being sued about is, in many cases, its own speech. Okay. So if Tucker Carlson is speaking, I don't believe Tucker's one of the defendants, but there are other Fox hosts who are defendants. And Tucker Carlson, or one of these other Fox hosts, is speaking as part of their official job capacity as a Fox host, then that's classic. I mean, in the same way, if I'm writing for the Dispatch and what I write for the Dispatch, which is edited by the Dispatch, published by the Dispatch, is libelous, then I'm liable and the Dispatch is liable, because my speech that I publish in my capacity as a Dispatch employee, edited by the Dispatch, has been traditionally deemed the Dispatch's speech as well as mine. So you would traditionally sue David French and the Dispatch. Nobody do that, please, but that's the way it works. Now, the big question is, what about guests, right?
That's what I was just going to say. What about a Rudy Giuliani or a Donald Trump who's frequently on a platform like Fox News and enthusiastically welcomed?
Now, this is going to be where facts matter a lot. So it's a traditional matter. If I invite a guest on, that guest is responsible for their own speech. Okay. Especially, you filed a lawsuit. What's your lawsuit about? Like Sidney Powell, or so that
right.
Linwood and, some of these other crazies who were and they're certainly liable for their own actions as well. So the question is, to what extent is Fox liable if they bring a guest on and the guest says something wild and crazy, et cetera? And the general rule is you're going to give a news organization wide latitude there, because otherwise, to even having a guest and having a guest on and questioning a guest is actually part of the fact-finding process of news gathering, right? So if you're going to say, well, we're not going to even have someone on to question them as a journalist, unless what I know they're going to say is, I know they're going to say true things, you've just destroyed press freedom right there.
Right.
However, if a producer says, Sky, I need you on this segment to make this argument. I need you on, and you work with me on the content of your communication, then you're starting to blur some of this stuff. And then if I talk to you and I create a news report the news report is defamatory based in part on the content I got from you, which I knew or should have known was completely false, then that's another issue as well. So
yeah, that's the gray area for me. So Fox News has Sidney Powell on as a legal representative for the Trump campaign. First time she's on, Sidney Powell says Dominion voting machines are being controlled by, Italian Jews through Venezuela to corrupt the election, blah, blah, blah. And everyone who hears this live on television, including the Fox correspondent who's there or the anchor who's there, is wide-eyed going, oh my gosh, this is nuts, but doesn't say anything. But then they invite her back on 15 more times in the subsequent weeks, and she continues to make this claim over and over and over again, and no one on air or any representative of Fox News challenges or demands evidence for it. At what point does Fox News become culpable for spreading that misinformation because they're not questioning it, they're not challenging it, they're not looking for evidence, and they keep inviting this to be repeated over and over and over again? Doesn't that at some point become a passive form of speech where we're giving the platform, we're not challenging it, we're not engaged in journalistic challenge, and we know it's not true?
Yeah, so this is something where it gets really gray. So unlike being a user of a social media platform where you have posting rights until you violate the terms of service, right? So you have your posting rights, and when you violate the terms of service, you are booted. With Fox News, you're invited. Right. No one just pops up, right?
Exactly.
So the question then is, and Fox's lawyers will say, wait, look, if you've got a central player in one of the most important news stories of our time, like for a time, believe it or not, Sidney Powell was one of the central players in the most important news story of our time, you cannot tell a social media company, a news company, you can't talk to them. Just like you couldn't tell them not to talk to Yasser Arafat when Yasser Arafat back in the day would come on and say lie after lie after lie after lie about Israel. a good journalist challenges Sidney Powell, right? A good journalist challenges Sidney Powell and says, Sidney Powell, what you said today and what you said yesterday and what you said the day before, none of it checks out. None of it is true, or presses Sidney Powell, or, that's why the real actual core argument with Fox is going to be a lot less about its guests and a lot more about its hosts. And so, because if you put together, what's the rule? You can invite lying newsmakers onto, you can invite dishonest newsmakers onto journalistic enterprises only so long as you expose their dishonesty, when the actual inviting of the newsmaker is part of the process of truth, of discerning the truth. And
isn't part of Fox's defense, though, that they're not entirely a journalistic enterprise and that they're for entertainment?
Well, some of it. So, for example, some of it is then going to be that Tucker Carlson is an opinion journalist.
Mm-hmm.
So, opinion is going to be got much stronger protections under the First Amendment than a expression of fact. Okay, so to say that Tucker Carlson is offering his opinion is the really key defense. The fact that Tucker Carlson's an entertainer is only relevant to, in essence, the way the courts would say how seriously you should take Tucker Carlson, which is sort of, not to get too deep into the weeds, which is how much should someone take what Tucker says as an assertion of fact versus hyperbole?
Right. And in some former reading I did a while ago about this, Fox News' own attorneys were saying a reasonable person would not have taken this content as factual, which is sort of insulting to their own audience. They're basically saying our audience watches us to laugh at this because it's so ridiculous, no sensible person would believe it.
Right. So they're basically saying no reasonable person would take Tucker Carlson's assertions in that instance as true. That does not mean, now that's an argument that is one that will often fail, because it's sort of a last ditch defense. So the first defense to a defamation allegation is the truth. So what Tucker said was true. Then Tucker wins, right?
Right, but that's not open to them.
Right, but if what Tucker said, and again, we're just using him as an example because I don't know that he's a defendant in one of these specific suits, but we're using him as an illustration. There are other hosts who are defendants, but we'll just say other Fox host. So you have other Fox host who says something that's not true. Okay, well then what's your defense? Then your defense would be, well, it might not be true, but it was false, but it was a false about a public figure, and so there wasn't the requisite level of actual malice. Well, that's a defense, right? Or it was false, but it was such obvious hyperbole that no reasonable person would accept it as a statement of fact. Or it was false, but there are no damages. It didn't hurt this person. And so those are different kinds of defenses that you use when one defense, which is what we said was true, is off the table. But Fox is going to stand or fall, as a general matter, much more, and this is the way it should be, much more on what its actual employees say than what its guests say. Because it gets super dangerous when you start intruding on press freedom because of what newsmakers say in the context of a news interview.
Well, this has been really illuminating, David. We've talked a lot over the last couple of years about religious freedom. We haven't talked as much about freedom of speech. And you've said repeatedly that religious freedom is in a very strong, secure place. But there's all kinds of gray areas around freedom of speech right now because of social media, because of both politicians on the right and the left trying to push laws that use government to force speech or suppress it. It's a very fascinating area, and I keep my eye on it, and I'm grateful for your input on it. We didn't get into a bunch of the other stuff I really wanted to cover, but we'll have to save that for 2023. Have a great trip. I hope you get good weather and open roads, and have a great holiday.
Well, thank you, Sky. When you sent me the list, I thought we're going to get through like 1.5 of these bullet points here.
I'd rather have too much than too little.
No, it was great. And there's a reason why First Amendment law is taught in entire courses in law school rather than entire podcasts, because it can get complicated at the edges. The general thrust of it is pretty straightforward and simple, but in the edges, it gets really complicated, as we can see.
It does. So next time or in the future, we're going to talk about the 303 creative case before the Supreme Court about the wedding website designer, and is that free speech or is it a service? There's lots to cover here.
Yeah.
We'll get back to it. But until then, have a good one. Thanks, David.
Thanks so much, Sky. Appreciate it.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Sky Jatani. Production by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.